Thank you, Mayor. My name is Jim Callahan. I live 2 blocks from here at 204 East South Street. Before I get into the history that I wanted to talk about, when you do a historic restoration, you have to start from something. Whether it's blueprints, we might have a postcard that shows what the stands look like before the 63 stands were built, or there might be some blueprints for the 63 stands. I don't know. Does anyone know? There was a computer scientist, Norbert Weiner, who once said that the best model of a material model of a cat is a cat. You could have diagrams or pictures or other things, but as long as we still have those stands, even in that dilapidated condition that I saw on Friday, we have something more to go on in terms of what we want to do in terms of restoration. If we tear those down and there's no archaeological evidence left, what do we have left to build a restoration with? To understand what was there? It's just a practical problem, and if we want to get funding from the kind of funding agencies that do historical restoration, it's helpful to still have something there and not a flat space where it once was. But anyway, the title of my remarks today is 50. 50 can mean a lot of things. 50 years, 50 states, and the title of a movie playing 2 blocks from here, 50 Shades of Grey. And all of them are relevant today. 210 years ago this week, 600 people peaceably assembled to march to their state capital to petition their governor, Governor George C. Wallace, for redress of grievances. That peaceful assembly in Selma was met with violence, an event known as Bloody Sunday, an event that was remembered yesterday in the City Hall in the lobby. Not only were the leaders of that march, Hosea Williams and John Lewis, later to become Congressman John Lewis, attacked, but the men on horseback attacked the entire assembly. The entire assembly was attacked. That's something to keep in mind when we remember the courage of the 2,000 people who assembled here in Orlando in the 1963 grandstands the year before Selma, 51 years ago, this past week, to hear Dr. Martin Luther King speak at Tinker Field. And there are a couple generations of people who were in the grandstands. The generation of parents that assembled at Tinker Field knew of the dynamite explosion that killed Harry T. Moore and Harriet Moore in their home in Mims, Florida, which is due east of Sanford, on Christmas Day in 1951, less than 25 years before the speech at Tinker Field. In fact, less than 15 years before the speech. The generation of parents, of grandparents, that generation of parents knew about Harry T. Moore as a teacher who registered voters, advocated for equal pay, founded a chapter of the NAACP, and dared to report the misconduct of the notorious Lake County Sheriff Willis McCall to the governor over his conduct in the Groveland rape case. But the earlier generation, the generation of grandparents that were in the grandstands in 1964 at Tinker Field, knew a darker story. The story of July Perry, who with Mose Norman attempted to vote in Ocoee, Florida on Election Day in November 1920. July Perry was shot in Ocoee, brought to jail in Orlando, sprung from jail, and hung by rope from a tree in Orlando near the home of Judge Cheney, and buried in an unmarked grave in Orlando's Greenwood Cemetery. But the grandparents knew more. They knew that all of the black residents had fled Ocoee, abandoning or selling their property in distress sales. Today, in hindsight, we might call that an ethnic cleansing. But in 1964, the 1920 lynching of July Perry in Orlando and the Ocoee riot were less than 50 years earlier. Less time than separates us today in 2015 from the speech in 1964. The parents and grandparents who courageously gathered at Tinkerfield in 1964 knew the names of July Perry and Harry Moore, just as the people here today know the name of Trayvon Martin. Just as people today, after the events of Stanford, Ferguson, and Staten Island, have had the talk with their sons, the parents and grandparents at Tinkerfield had their talk with their sons.
30 seconds.
Certain residents of Orlando opposed race mixing. That's what the newspaper articles talk about when they talk about the Martin Luther King speech. But already a child was born of a white mother and African-American father in the 50th state who went on to become President of the United States. Dr. King was killed in Memphis in '68, but his grief lived on, and only 40 years later, that child became the 44th President of the United States.
Time, Jim, you need to wrap it up.
Okay. I hope you restore Tinkerfield and remember the people who gathered there.
Thank you. Mary Isaacson and then Doug Hebb.